thinking through categories of difference in the context of India, but very much related to this class in terms of questions of environmental justice and other topics of equity that people might be interested in. So please do try and see which of the panels and sessions you can attend, right? And more information will be forthcoming in due time, especially as we receive all the abstracts and titles of the paper presenters. Any questions about those events? Anyone take a look at the Smithsonian Anacostia Museum events or the EJ conference? Do you think you're going to go, Shay, to the?
Yeah, I've already registered for the EJ conference.
The other one, the Anacostia one, yeah. Hi. Okay, I am about a third away through grading your synthesis papers, so I will get them to you as soon as I can. I'm really enjoying reading them so far. Today we're going to talk about decolonial approaches to environmental justice, or what we can categorize in this table that I put up last week, which signifies lineages of environmental justice thought, right? We can call it sort of EJ2, second generation environmental justice. So can people remind me about these various categories that I filled in last time? So urban political ecology, first generation, urban political ecology, second generation, environmental justice, first generation, and environmental justice, second generation, with what these categories are right? And so I talked about how last week how, if you asked a question as a PhD student to lay out what are the most influential categories of thought within environmental justice, you would sort of paint this kind of picture. So can people help me fill this out? What would be kind of major theories and methods that you saw in Urban Political Ecology 1 that we saw kind of through the metabolism stuff? Yeah.
For theories and methods, you said it was qualitative, historical, ethnographic, and Marxist.
Marxist, but often with a Eurocentric view, right? Because a lot of these studies, right, were very much concerned with the relationship between labor, the environment, and the urbanization process under capitalism, right? So the use of metabolism as a framework to understand the exploitation of both labor and resources, right? And so key analytic there that we saw was really metabolism, right? To understand urban environmental processes. Okay, under UPE2, and we are going to be reading some of that stuff on the water justice section of the class. What was some stuff that we saw as a kind of response to this Marxist thing? Yes, Eric.
It was included things like feminist perspective, post-colonial, true love, Fredericks.
Right. So with the second generation of urban political ecology studies, right, it was kind of decentering just the Marxist emphasis on capitalism and really bringing into view, everyday embodied harms that is experienced differentially by gender, right, and positionality, looking at sort of the post-colonial city and its particularities as far as informality and governance go, as being different from the European experience, right, of property rights that are very clearly defined with legal and illegal. It's much more blurred with the post-colonial thing. We also had much more focus on, in terms of analytics, on representation and discourse, right, as we saw in the readings on Orientalism. And we'll see much later the kind of embodied experiences in the true love piece, as Eric rightly pointed out. Right? So feminist, post-colonial. You also see in some of the more recent urban political ecology stuff a focus on abolition ecologies. Right? So specifically anti-racist approaches to thinking about environmental justice. And again, we'll see a little bit of that later on, but just to put that on your radar, because it links very nicely to EJ2 and the stuff we saw in the readings today. Okay, what about EJ1? Yes?
It was more large and quantitative work that was focused on with case law, the use of case law.
Yep.
With very little theory.
Yes, so large and quantitative studies focus on case law review, right? Little theory. It was mostly sociological descriptions, right? And assumptions about categories of difference. You sort of just take race as a given, right? But large and quant. And yeah, just to specify here, the approach has been much more qualitative and historical as well. Okay. Analytics, what were the terms that you saw? Even though not much theory, what were kind of terms that kept coming up over and over again in Dorcetta Taylor's book? It's basically the basis upon which a lot of law is determined in the United States. Precedence is a good one, yeah, but that wasn't as front and center as a term that she used a lot.
Disproportionate impact.
Thank you. Disproportionate impact. Right? That's an analytic that the first generation EJ studies, the one that were very much the emphasis of Dorcetta Taylor's book, right, was really using this analytic of, right, who is disproportionately burdened by the siting of toxic wastes, industrial facilities, right, et cetera, and kind of asking questions of, explaining that disproportionate impact. Right? So that was a very key analytic here. He also talked about a little bit within the larger literature on procedural justice. Right? So are EJ communities included in terms of lawmaking, in terms of deliberation, in terms of governance, right? And you see this a little bit in the larger EJ literature, but Dorcetta Taylor was really focused on disproportionate impact. Right? These are the kind of analytics of the literature, of the scholarship. Okay, EJ2, which is what we're going to talk about today, the decolonial approaches. What were some of the differences? Yeah.
Post-colonial approaches were basically a bunch of genius French people sitting there theorizing about the world. Whereas decolonial takes it to the local level.
Okay, so as opposed to post-colonial, which was derived from Foucault, but also had this specific emphasis with Orientalism and Edward Said's work and Uday Singh Mehta's on not just French folks, but other South Asian and Middle Eastern scholars, was much more thinking large-scale representation and discourse, whereas decolonial theory, right, seeks to center the voices and experiences and worldviews of those they are purportedly writing about. Unlike, in some ways, post-colonial theory, which is a little bit more, right, up here, bird's eye view. In terms of analytics, in terms of methods, it's very much qualitative, right, and historical ethnographic work as well. But it tends to be very much more also theoretical, right? So it's like kind of the opposite of little theory, right? It's really looking at sort of knowledge frameworks. And we'll see a couple of the key analytics here, right? Particularly, we're looking at critical race theory. Right? Decoloniality as an analytic, and racial capitalism. Okay, and to get us started on that transition from the first generation quantitative to the second generation, can you remind me of the three major debates that preoccupied those quantitatively oriented scholars in EJ1? Yes, Shannon.
Race versus class.
Yes.
The chicken or egg debate.
Which was, can you explain that, please?
Did the waste sites come first, or did the communities of color come first?
Yes, exactly. Which moved in first, the toxic waste site or the communities of color, right? Good. And the third one?
Intention or free market?
Yes. No. So that was discriminatory intent versus market dynamics. Is it a question that there was malicious intent involved in the siting of that particular facility there? Or was it just trickle-down economics, that was the cheapest land and therefore made the most sense, right? Okay, so those are the three debates that occupy these quantitatively oriented scholars. What are some limitations of framing scholarship, research, policy agendas, et cetera, in these terms. What are some pitfalls? What are some traps of even asking the question this way? Yeah.
It might not be either of those things if you're doing like a two-part question. It could be something else, but you're only looking at those two elements.
Okay, so you narrow down the choices in some ways, but right, as Mariah was saying, it could very much be the intersection of race and class, right? In fact, it's very difficult to isolate race as a single variable, right, when it so often intersects with race, right? So it's the intersection of race and class that might matter the most. Okay, other limitations of this particular approach, this particular narrowing of the debate and research questions that way. So it could be intersection, so why are we asking an or question?
Is that like discriminatory intent is super hard to prove legally? Also is like one thing.
Yes, right? So here I'm going to push a little bit further that not only is discriminatory intent hard to prove, but when you set up the question this way, is racism either malicious intent, basically, or just not present? You narrow the definition of what constitutes racism, right? So you narrow the conceptual terrain on race. And that is exactly the argument that critical race theorists made who came, right, and were kind of engaging with some of these quantitative studies, not just in environmental justice, but a lot across sort of academic disciplines, right? So these two are major kind of critiques of the narrow-mindedness in many ways of the kind of analysis that was coming out of EJ1. And therefore, we need ways of thinking and defining and conceptualizing, right, race, right, racial discrimination, racial identity, and intersectionality, the fact that race actually works very much in conjunction with other types of identity, right, to sort of deepen our understanding of, well, how does injustice actually happen, if that is the ultimate goal, and what to do about it. And so I'm going to lay out the foundations of three really important from the standpoint of the second generation that we've in the past called critical or decolonial environmental justice studies. And those are, one, critical race theory and Latinx CRT, right, which is a spin-off of CRT, specifically focused on questions of immigration and positionality along the border. We talk about racial formation and the critique of racial liberalism. I have the book here as well by critical legal theorist Charles W. Mills, which is very much getting at sort of the institutional nature of racism. And then decolonial theory and border thinking, right? And I'll define some of these terms for you. And finally, the Black radical tradition, from which we get racial capitalism, and from the feminist variants, we get intersectionality. So the purpose of this part of class is really to give us all like a vocabulary to work with, right? So that we can delve more deeply into some of the questions and critiques and limitations as well of the second generation of EJ studies. Okay. One of the foundational texts for observing, that our definition of race and racism were very limited in the United States, right? And therefore, B, to reconceptualize race, is a book called Racial Formation in the US, and it's subsequently been applied elsewhere as well, by the sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Winott. Think back to those redlining maps we looked at in great detail, early 20th century America. I had you all open up those databases and look at them. What was white then is very different from what we think of as white now, right? And critical race theory and the sort of idea of racial formation holds that race is not constant. It cannot be a variable that you just assume is constant over time and that you can isolate, right? And there are a couple of key tenets of critical race theory that were put forth in Omi and Winant's book. The first, right, is something that we kind of take for granted nowadays, but has a very long and troubled history, right? Which is that race is not given by biology. Now, this is a really difficult one to sort of get your heads around initially, because you often think that what makes a person's skin color darker, what makes a person's hair look different, right, has to be given by biology. And in some senses, that is true. There are racial phenotypes that explain physical characteristics, right? But those racial phenotypes, those different phenotypes, right, don't naturally constitute a given race, right? So in fact, two people of a different race might have very similar genes in many ways, but just might have a couple of phenotypes that are different. So there's no such thing as the race gene, right? There is ancestry, and that you can use genetic testing to link to. But there is no such thing as the race gene. And so therefore, race is a social construct, right? It is something that seems deceptively naturalized and normalized, but it is ultimately a social construct, one that shifts over time and geography. To be mestizo in Latin America isn't even the same across every geographical context. To be white or European in Brazil is different than to be white or European here, right? So it's a social construct that categorizes human bodies according to physical, cultural, geographic, and linguistic affinities. But it is not just neutral. It's not just given, even though it often seems that it is. And that's why we have to say it's the social construct. Right? Now, we often use this related term ethnicity. And just to define it, right, ethnicity is also a social construct. But ethnicity has this sense of national and linguistic affinity more than race does. That's why we think of Latinx and Hispanic as an ethnicity, but Black and Caucasian as races. And that's why we use the term race and ethnicity when we talk about categorizations in the US Census. What's really key, as I already have started alluding to, is that race is not constant. It shifts over time and places, right? And as was rightly said by Maria, right, it's not an either-or question. It intersects with other categories. And this is why Omi and Winant use this great term, racial formation. And I love the word formation because it implies that it is not just a kind of assemblage of things that comes together, a formation, but it's also kind of in the process of becoming. Although it might seem stable, after all, being Jewish was not to be white in the 1930s, right? That stability is deceiving because it changes over time. Redlining was a racial project. Redlining equated home ownership and property value with a particular racial formation. Right? So racial formations arise, brought into being through particular racial projects, is one of the main arguments of their books. And it is thus that they prefer to think about race as a racial formation rather than as a static, atemporal, apolitical, and stable category. And because Omi and Winant use these key critiques of earlier understandings of race, right, they also brought us to an understanding of racism not based on either disproportionate impact nor procedural injustice. Right? For Ami and Winant, right, racism is prejudice not just based on discriminatory intent, right, or disproportionate impact, right, either on the one end or the other end, or not just based on kind of limited ideas of who can participate in the legal system procedurally, right, but is based on institutional or systemic discrimination. Right? That means that particular hierarchies are reproduced even when there is no clear intent that you can pin on particular individuals. You guys talked last time about the very good example of standardized testing and the kind of pitfalls when not only are particular minorities discouraged from taking standardized tests, such as the SAT and GRE, but women are too. Right? There's the intersectionality of gender and race in the school system. And so this kind of vocabulary on disproportionate impact, right, even the procedural justice, which was used as a kind of way to qualify that it's not just about impact, but also about procedure, were both seen as limiting, not to mention that sort of these sets of debates were really limiting for the reasons I've just mentioned, right? What does it matter if we're talking about whether minorities moved in first or the facility moved in first, when you have a whole slew of racial property regimes and racial projects that are actually creating discrimination within the housing market that's not just reducible to the chicken or egg debate, right? Creating immobilities, as Rosita Taylor said. So she kind of gets there, but she just doesn't use this kind of framework and theoretical language because she's not trained that way, right? That's not her training as a quantitatively oriented environmental sociologist. Right? And so this is kind of to think sympathetically with both the limitations and the kinds of things that certain strands of literature and scholarship produce. To elaborate on some of the institutional dynamics of, hi there. No worries. Yeah, for sure. To elaborate on some of the institutional dynamics of institutional racism, Charles W. Mills, a Caribbean-based theorist, wrote an early book called The Racial Contract, and has then subsequently built his argument over 3 decades, and has now just recently published Black Rights, White Wrongs, The Critique of Racial Liberalism. I'll just pass this around. You know I love bringing books to class because I know several of you are PhD-oriented, and not only those of you doing PhDs, but others of you also, right? And he really, which is a framework that I've been very interested and inspired by, he really went and sort of looked at the very sort of structures, legal structures, political structures that are seeped in classical liberal political theory, right? And critiqued those very foundational structures for being racialized. And I think that we saw that in some of the earlier readings, especially in Uday Singh Mehta's readings, although Uday Singh Mehta comes out of more of a post-colonial tradition. So you see a lot of cross-fertilization between UPE2 and EJ2 in terms of critical race theory, being fertilized by post-colonial theory and vice versa, right? These are lineages that come out of particular academies and spaces around the world, but there's a lot of learning that happens between them. Right? So Charles Mills' work in critical race theory as being one of the key ones, along with Ami and Winant and Bonilla Silva, which I'll talk about next, has kind of used this vocabulary of the ways in which liberalism reproduces racial hierarchies through laws, structures, and institutions. The challenge with some of that critical race theory, as you can see with his title, right, which has been very sort of clear, black rights, white wrongs, is something that I've talked about earlier, which is this sort of meta-narrative of black versus white, right? Which is so, at the same time, important in the American context, but also tends to kind of reduce the horizon of understanding racial difference, right, more broadly than that. For instance, there are Afro-Latino populations, right? There are a whole interesting intersections of Black and Native American populations, right, that aren't necessarily accounted for in some of these literatures that obviously aim to lay bare institutional racism, but end up talking about experiences and history in a way that kind of reproduces this black-white meta-narrative. And so Latinx critical race theorists, in particular, kind of veteran who's the president of the American Sociological Association right now, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who's at Duke University, and Marisol LeBron at UT Austin, right, have kind of been, and Marisol LeBron is kind of my generation rising star, like, you know, super now being published and cited in the field, has kind of carved out a Latinx critical race theory that better accounts for the unique forms of oppression that Latinx, Afro-Latinx, and mestizos, right, those of mixed European and indigenous inheritance, experience that are not necessarily accounted for in earlier generations of critical race theory. And not just about racial formation and ethnic formation, but also about how these intersect with sexuality, language, immigration status, right? And of course the colonial relations within the Latin American context that might be different, right? Ongoing relations of colonialism with Puerto Rico, right? A particularly fraught border relationship with Mexico, right? And these were kind of analytics that started entering the picture, right, that weren't necessarily there with critical race theory alone. So now we're sort of transitioning from Latin CRT to decolonial theory, which I'll do in a second. But before that, I want to talk about this really interesting example that was brought up a little bit in the Laura Pulido reading, Laura Pulido and Juan de Lara. But they didn't really go into it in a lot of detail. And so I want to use the case to think about why some of these theories that I've just explained to you have actually borne out in sort of movements that have been important for urban, social, and environmental justice. So I want to talk about the Young Lords. Anyone heard of it before reading about and seeing them in Pulido's article? No? So the Young Lords were galvanized at a time where there was a lot of very kind of active social movements in the United States, right around the time of the civil rights movement, so the 1960s. And Puerto Ricans in both Chicago and New York, right, lived in neighborhoods that were often referred to as barrios, even in the United States. And these were neighborhoods where garbage was often not picked up, right? It was because of the low sort of political clout of those areas, where there was disproportionate numbers of forced evictions, right? Where on little pretext, which we see happening in certain neighborhoods in the U.S. today. And there was, of course, a lot of police violence and tensions between Puerto Rican communities, between Boricuas and police, right? So the Young Lords came together as an intersectional movement, including Puerto Rican women, including youth, right, to sort of take urban metabolism into their own hands, especially around sanitation and waste. So following, remember I talked to you about the very first lecture, Martin Luther King was protesting the Memphis sanitation workers' plight the day before he was killed. And he kind of inspired what was known as the garbage offensive for the Young Lords. And it started in Chicago, and then it also took place in New York, where they started collecting garbage on their own, right? And they started raising awareness about the fact that barrios were basically forms of internal colonialism within the United States, right? There was this, and they started using the frameworks that had been developed within Latin America and applying it to their plight here. So there was a kind of a traveling of experiences, which is also what border thinking is talking about, is the kind of collapsing of these nation-state borders, right? And these kind of nation-state borders which have not necessarily served the minorities of those areas. Now, the Young Lords platform fought against sort of broadly speaking, capitalism. They were very much for redistributive economics, labor rights, and were very wary of the kinds of partnerships between urban elites and real estate developers and political and elected representatives in major New York City, and that was often known as machine politics, right? So they called out machine politics, or the kind of ways in which, right, urban profit was generated. But interestingly, they also linked with decolonial struggles that were happening around the world. Right? They were very much inspired by the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s, but particularly a movement that then continued to happen in Mexico called the Zapatistas. And in fact, many of their sort of speeches, they referenced Emiliano Zapata, who fought on behalf of poor Mexican peasants who were not receiving the land reforms and land redistribution that they were owed when the Mexican state promised this. And I talk about this because I feel like it was a time of hope, some of that which has been eviscerated today. Because the Young Lords reached out and made alliances with the American Indian movement, as it was known back then, with the Black Panthers, who were a radical Black Power movement, right, that were much more sort of concerned that civil rights had not been fully achieved than some of the more moderate Black civil rights leaders, with the Brown Berets, who were a Chicanx movement, right, and even with a group of poor white Appalachians who came to parts of the industrializing North and Northeast from Appalachia, right, in search of jobs. And these were known as the Young Patriots. So you saw an alliance forming, an interracial alliance between groups that were seeing themselves as internally colonial. And they used this language, and they were linking with the decolonizing struggles that were happening in Africa, because the last one happened in 1969, right? And although the upper echelons of these leaderships did not have women, several of the more intermediate roles featured women, especially in the Young Lords, because one of the things they were trying to fight was machismo in Latino culture. Right? So this was a really interesting time of interracial solidarity. And what you see happening in the manifestos of the Young Lords, the Young Patriots, who talked about their brothers and their sisters, right, in Africa and in Asia. There's a kind of Afro-Asian solidarity, right? You saw this kind of inter-referencing happening. As you know from a development class, or perhaps just knowing a little bit about world history, the 1940s to 60s was a time of global decolonization, right? So this word decolonial is not used lightly, it actually happened. It was a time when European powers finally agreed to leave, officially speaking, many of the places where they had established peripheral territories. And you saw a kind of movement happening where of the non-aligned peoples. It's called the non-aligned peoples movement, especially focusing on countries in Africa and Asia. Does anyone know what that is? Movement of non-aligned peoples. What were they aligning with and not aligning with? What do they call it that? There was a famous conference.
Same thing as not aligning with the Soviet Union or the United States?
Yeah. So can you just say that a little bit, explain that a bit more?
What?
Can you just explain that a bit more?
Oh, it was led mostly by India, I believe.
Indonesia and in India.
There was a tension between the Western world, led by the United States, basically, and the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, and then there were these residual countries that didn't line up one way or the other. And they started kind of trying to coalesce as a third bloc.
Right. So as Brian is talking about, the movement of non-aligned peoples were former colonies who did not wish to align with either the United States or the USSR in the Cold War. And they came together at a conference known as the Bandung Conference, which I talked about as the tail end of ruler colonialism in Indonesia, to affirm this sort of commitment of former colonial peoples, right, to establishing world peace. They were like, we don't want to play any part of your arms race. We don't want to promote your agendas that are either American or Russian, right? We want to have this kind of alliance of third world peoples. And that was of great interest to this interracial solidarity, the Black Panthers, the Young Patriots, the Young Lords, the Brown Berets that I talked about earlier, right? That this sort of alliance on this mutual historical experience, right, was really interesting to them. And in fact, as I said, they used what they saw happening elsewhere to frame the discourse around their own struggles. So you had this term internal colonialism being used by Black Panther activists, right, by the Young Lords to discuss their predicament within the United States, all the while referencing colonialism and decolonization that was happening elsewhere. Okay, which is what brings me then to decolonial theory and border thinking. So I use that kind of actual historical example of the Young Lords, upon which Matthew Gandy, who kind of sits within this field, has written an environmental justice story of, right? Especially focusing on their work in New York City. And I think that provides a nice segue into decolonial theory and border thinking, because as the reading for today talked about, that interracial solidarity I just spoke about represented a kind of hopeful space of convergence, right? There was the coming together of these groups on sort of similar grounds, but still different intersectional identities to frame a particular agenda, right? And to disrupt these sort of given nation-state borders separating, right, the first world from the third world. These nation-state borders that were very much given out of the colonial project. The term border thinking under decolonial theory was first articulated by Gloria Anzaldúa, a Colombian, Afro-Colombian theorist. Right? And she used this idea of border thinking, especially to refer to the relationship that people have who live very near the Mexican-American border, right? Thinking about, like, so what are the power dynamics that are created out of this border, right? How do people actually live in ways that kind of transgress this border and experience in ways that actually make this border, right, very much a social artifact and a source of political power, but not really how people are actually experiencing life. So she did a lot of her ethnographic work at the actual border, right? But she used the metaphor of the border to think more broadly about stepping outside of colonial knowledge frameworks. Whether those knowledge frameworks are, right, what give us particular categories of race, whether they're frameworks that give us, okay, this is a nation-state boundary and this is a nation-state boundary, you know, whether they're knowledge frameworks that describe who is modern versus who is backwards, right? So she used this idea of border thinking as a metaphor to destabilize accepted wisdoms and knowledge. She also did this really interesting thing that was kind of a border thinking sort of approach, which is that she problematized indigeneity. We take indigenous as a category for granted. What do you think it might mean to problematize indigeneity? To think more deeply? What does indigenous mean to you all? Yeah. People that have been in an area for a long period of time. Original inhabitants. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would say specifically, like,
Okay. Okay. Who are indigenous in America? Native Americans. How does their indigeneity get established? Who is Cherokee? Is it Elizabeth Warren? Bureau of Indian Affairs. Yeah, can you say a little bit more? Is that they come up with these distinctions?
I'm not sure like exactly how it works, but yeah, you actually have to qualify as a tribe through the U.S.
Yes.
government. And there are several tribes in the U.S. that are not actually recognized to have historic lineage.
Yes.
Countries.
Absolutely, right? So the way in which indigeneity gets established in America is through a Bureau of Indian Affairs that says, oh, you're 20% Cherokee, you can belong to the Cherokee Nation. How does the 20% Cherokee get established? Through a blood test. Did you say that? Hi, who are you?
I'm Leah, sorry.
Welcome. Absolutely, through a blood test. And what did we just say about race? Is it based on genetic testing? So what happened when Elizabeth Warren claimed that she was Cherokee? You guys read a little bit about that? Is it confusing to you? Yes. People wanted a blood test. Did she provide it? Yes. What did it show? That she has somewhere back there some great-great-great-grandfather. We don't even know if they were Cherokee or Delaware. But she wanted to use it to prove some amount of indigeneity. In fact, Trump called her Pocahontas because she had used her indigenous status in a law school entrance form. Really interesting. When you problematize indigeneity, you question the categories by which people claim to be indigenous and which indigenous identity is excluded. Both the inclusion and the exclusion. Native American theorists, especially Kim Tallbear, whose work I read a lot, and by the way, I also have a great book by Leanne Betsamosaki Simpson, as we have always done on indigenous freedom through radical resistance. It's very much kind of getting at some of this decolonial indigenous thinking. But Kim Tallbear wrote this piece about Elizabeth Warren. And she said, by Elizabeth Warren bringing up this whole blood test thing, right? Her heart's sort of in the right place. She wants to claim this, minority solidarity, like I'm with the people, right? The subjugated people. But she's reproducing forms of violence that were used to categorize and police indigenous bodies in the US. And they were very upset that she used that blood test argument because they said, what explains indigenous identity to us as Native Americans is a whole host of lived experiences, right? Where you actually culturally associate with Native Americans and you can trace your ancestry, right? Which gets conflated with blood tests because blood often assumes genetics tests, but ancestry is a little bit different, right? And if you can trace your ancestry to particular indigenous folks, and you've had this lived experience and social relationship, right? That's what more constitutes indigeneity than these government-classified Bureau of Indian Relations sort of mathematical testing, right? 20% or 19%. 19% no can do, 20% can do. Right? She's like, that's not how we do it in terms of, right? So I'm just telling you about this kind of strand of critical thinking that problematizes how even the kind of assumptions you have about who is indigenous and who is not, right, comes from a place of power. And rather than just accepting that, right, that we have to kind of question how these categories come about, which is really, I think, fascinating, especially since many of us don't understand necessarily the range of biological, genetic, right, political, social, territorial debates around Native Americanness in the United States, which is another result of settler colonial erasure, the fact that many of us really don't understand this, right? Okay. So decoloniality, just finally to define that, and then I'll move to the Black radical tradition, and then we'll break. Decoloniality is very much related to border thinking, specifically coming out of Latin America. So we're kind of moving further south now. Border thinking sort of, right, Mexico, United States border, but decoloniality very much coming out of Arturo Escobar's work, right? Walter Mignolo, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Anibal Quijano, right? Sylvia Wynter in the Caribbean, also, but very much Afro-Caribbean, right? And so these are theorists that have articulated this idea of coloniality, decoloniality, and modernity, right? This kind of triad. Sometimes it's known as the MCD project. And this was specifically a critique of Western critical social theory, especially ideas of modernity put forth by the Frankfurt School. So this is something that some of you may or may not be familiar with. But the Frankfurt School included major social theorists such as Habermas, right? Adorno, Horkheimer, and Foucault. And in particular, they go after this notion that modernity, right, is somehow a break from old, archaic forms of rule, right? So Habermas, in a very famous text called A Discourse on Modernity, said that the word modo, or modernus, comes to us from Latin, right, which is a period of time when Western civilization tried to distinguish Christianity from earlier pagan forms of rule. Paganism was backwards, Christianity is modern. And it established this teleology, right, between backward animist practices and Christianity. And Christianity was sort of advanced and modern, right? And everything else was kind of backward or pre-modern. So it establishes this kind of implicit timeline. And Habermas, as a social theorist, said, you know, modernity is not all great. There's been some bad things that have happened. But we can still use modernity to establish ourselves as rational, communicative individuals. So he has this theory of rational, communicative individualism, right? That we all as people can actually deliberate, come to a place of finding our individual rights, solve social injustices through a kind of modern framework, modern democratic systems, right, that are thankfully a break from the past and are more advanced than what we had before. So he critiques modernity, but he also finds a lot of hope in it, Habermas. The decolonial theorists are like, not so quickly, right? For them, modernity is an extension of colonialism and what they called coloniality, right? The kinds of relationships that Latin America established with Europe after it decolonized in the early 1800s, right, very much perpetuated this kind of dependency on those former European powers, even though it was ostensibly a kind of modern democratic system that they had entered. So basically, what the Decolonial project does is it says modernity is a form of neocolonialism. And it's ways in which colonial relations perpetuate in the contemporary through, for instance, dispossession of particular indigenous groups within Latin America today. That continues to happen, especially in the Colombian lowlands, right? That continues to happen in the form of resource extraction and mining in Ecuador, right? That continues to happen in the form of petroleum contracts being assigned, right, on indigenous land. These are upheld in the name of modernity, but they're really just, right? They're really just reestablishing kind of colonial relationships. And that comes in the form of power, colonialidad de poder, of knowledge, de saber, and of being, de ser. So the term in Spanish is colonialidad. Right? And of power is kind of these forms of economic extraction that perpetuate kind of colonial or exploitative relations of rule. So that's what power means. It's much more the economic realm. Knowledge, right, in terms of what do we take as the canon versus what do we take as sort of alternative knowledge. Right? And here they say that indigenous knowledge is always positioned outside of or more traditional compared to modern knowledge. And so we're constantly being fed this notion that indigenous knowledge is somehow inferior to modern Western knowledge. So that's the de saber. And then finally, de ser. Taking from Frantz Fanon the actual raw experience, right, of being dispossessed of land, territory, resources. That has happened throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, right? It's been especially violent in certain countries. There's been a special kind of erasure of native forms of governing land, right? Just as you see in the United States. And there's been state projects of miscegenation, known as mestizaje, right? Specifically to undermine kind of indigenous identity and mix it with European identity, right? So there's been very much state, and which often resulted in rape and sexual violence to indigenous women. So there's been sort of these ways in which coloniality continues to establish themselves, and Latin America becomes the context in which to think about that. Okay. Yes?
Do the decoloniality scholars explicitly talk to the forward thinking
Yes.
scholars?
Yes.
Really
No, absolutely. They're very kindred souls that way. And the article that we read for today actually talks about them both in the same breath. In fact, part of Walter Mignolo's work has been to co-author with border thinking scholars. So there's a lot more cross-fertilization between decoloniality thinking and border thinking than there is, let's say, with decolonial and post-colonial thinking, because those are very different geographic regions, right? Africa, Asia versus Latin America. Okay. So finally now, I want to move to the Black radical tradition, which has many similar theoretical preoccupations, but has also got some more explicitly economic understandings of the way racial discrimination work, as opposed to the decolonial or even post-colonial thought, which is very much around knowledge frameworks and experience and being, right? And Pulido and Juan de Lara suggest that we actually use and combine decolonial border thinking with the Black radical tradition, right, to reimagine justice. And you know, I think that there are kind of interesting critiques that we can make, and I'd love to hear about them. But I just want to lay out what their thesis is. So they talk about the Black radical tradition. And it's important that the Black radical tradition be situated in what you can think of as the long civil rights movement. Not the 1960s onwards, but the long civil rights movement stemming from abolitionist activism, right, in the mid-1800s. And the kinds of thinkers that sort of the late to late 1800s to early 1900s gave rise to. And so, you know, so the Black radical tradition can be traced from as early as Frederick Douglass, right, W.E.B. Du Bois onwards, who were very much concerned about the ways in which the abolition of slavery had still not really resulted in the kind of emancipation that was required. Right? And on to mid-20th century essayist and poet James Baldwin, who wrote very poetically about the Black experience in North America, to C.L.R. James, who was a Caribbean theorist who looked at, as I mentioned in an earlier class, the Haitian Revolution and its influence on civil rights struggles around the world, right? And also he did a very interesting economic analysis of the role that slavery played in wealth accumulation. To feminist theorists such as Audre Lorde and Angela Davis. And finally to Cedric Robinson, who is most attributed to the term racial capitalism. I'm going to talk about Cedric Robinson, in particular his work in the next slide, but I want to talk about the feminist theorist Audre Lorde for a second here. Because she, has this very, very evocative quote, which is for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? Which is kind of getting at some of the argument that Polito is making in her piece, really, that sort of turning to the state and these strictures that have historically been oppressive is kind of part of the problem, right? And so Lorde, very much aware of, and herself as a lesbian, black, and kind of very, in many ways, non-traditional activist in America, kind of grew weary of the master's tools, and was an important voice in really kind of questioning the foundations of institutions in the United States. Of all the theorists I put up, Cedric Robinson has had the most thoroughgoing analytic to think about, or perhaps rethink about, capitalism, right? And he was a student at the University of California, Berkeley in political science, and wrote his PhD, right, on a kind of reinterpretation of Marx. And he said one of the things that Marx didn't write about when he talked about the enclosure movement in Europe, right, was how even within Europe, the Slavs, the Gypsies, right, the Romas, these were racialized groups even within Europe that bore the brunt of a lot of the enclosure and primitive accumulation stuff that happened. But Marx was pretty silent about the role of racial hierarchy in creating capitalist value. The fact that it's not just the capitalist mode of production where you have a homogeneous group of proletariat and a homogeneous bourgeoisie, right? But that, in fact, the ability to categorize people according to particular values that they have or do not have, according to particular racial characteristics and particular racial projects, including, of course, slavery, right? These are actually fundamentally value-deriving economic processes, right? But that must rely on racial formations. And so he kind of rethought about the way Marx had discussed capitalism and said, these are some of the blind spots in Marx. And I'm going to write a book called Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. And in it, it's a really interesting kind of careful historical work that is both theoretical and historical, but that puts forth a lot of language that now in this second generation of EJ, including critical food geographies, black geographies, abolition ecologies, have now turned to this text that was written, several years ago, and have kind of rediscovered it. So Zach, you said you started reading this recently, right?
Yeah, like the first 20 pages.
What do you think?
It's kind of mind-blowing. Yeah, because he's basically, the part that I'm in, he's essentially rewriting the history of Europe and the history of, like what we think of as European peoples, essentially, and also the historical interaction between African people and Europe, which has been erased over time.
Mm-hmm. So he's both rewriting kind of an understanding of within Europe as well as Europe's interactions and kind of using racial capitalism to think through those relationships, both economic and social. Yeah, it's definitely a slog probably to get through the whole thing, but I'd be curious to check in with you after you do. And using this idea of abolitionism, which we typically refer to as the abolition of slavery, right? But to expand it beyond that as the elimination of the whole race-based structure. He has this very powerful term in his preface, right? Abolitionism is nothing but the elimination of the whole race-based structure. And in it also, and he's inspired kind of out-of-the-box thinking in how we need to do this, right? And so a lot of Black Marxism inspired nonviolent direct action, right? NVDA, boycotts, which actually have some really interesting economic implications, right? And in the kinds of ways in which you can use these theories of racial capitalism, the fact that value is derived on the basis of racial hierarchy, how do you turn that around, right? And actually use the economic system or ways to subvert the economic system to then also eliminate racial hierarchy. It's really interesting. It's certainly more economically focused than some of the other theorists who are more legal focused. Okay, so then finally to end, and not to forget another key concept within the Black radical tradition, which is intersectionality. So I talked about racial capitalism. I want to talk about intersectionality before we break. On the heels of the civil rights movement in the late 60s, Black women, queer women in particular, called attention to what they saw as the triple oppression of racism, sexism, and classism. And there was in particular a movement called the Combahee River Collective, right, which featured several of these activists who said, you know, even the Black Power movement was pretty gendered, right? I mean, we saw that there was some important interracial solidarities that were created, but ultimately there were some sexist, right, aspects of all these late 60s movements that basically ignored the fact that, that sexism is a really big problem, right? And that it is in fact the intersection of sexism, right, and racism that is felt especially acutely by poor women that we need to be talking about here. And the term intersectionality wasn't coined until later by the Harvard professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who used this term to say, look, it's not just identity that's intersectional, but also materiality. You can't separate health from housing and where you live, from environmental outcomes, right? It's the entangled experience of these various types of challenges, including, right, the environment, that especially intersectional environmental justice activists have now called for, right, that Kimberly Crenshaw centered in her work. So it was both the intersectionality of identity and the intersectionality of materialities, right, which I think is really interesting and really relevant for my own work. And I've been looking at intersectional climate justice in Washington, D.C., as I mentioned to you, drawing on a lot of these frameworks, connecting kind of the threat of particular climate harms that have been identified in D.C. with legacy toxicity and dumping in Ward 7 with food insecurity and with the paucity of transit networks, right? To think about climate change and climate injustices as really arising from the intersectionality of these issues, not to mention the significant racial histories of racial segregation and kind of racism in the area. So it's been really influential, I think, for kind of second generation EJ and political ecology scholars. So I'll end there just by putting up some kind of key tenets of decolonial and critical EJ. So I think what's key also is that this first generation really focused on disproportionate impacts as toxicity, right? But that subsequent generations have thought about the environment more broadly, including issues like food and housing and land, water, right, as part of the environment, than just disproportionate siting. Redefines racism to speak to institutional facets of racism and insists on intersectionality. Studies this idea of spaces of convergence, right? And kind of thinking about the history of social movements without romanticizing these. Traces multi-scalar relations of power, so those broadly speaking, right, at the level, at the kind of global level, but also nation state, and then more local. And you know, also redefines justice, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that in terms of do we have a way then to talk about justice if it's not just distributional and procedural, okay? And looks beyond the state in terms of where those solutions lie. All right, so I have a couple more books for you to browse through, including Black Marxism, which I wanted to pass around for anyone. Or sorry, no, this is not Black. This is actually a really interesting edited volume that comes on the as a kind of part 2 of Black Marxism by a range of scholars, and I found this to be a really interesting book too. So take a look at them, and we will reconvene at 6:45. Sorry, excuse me, 6:55.